The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. We hope you had a really good week. Ours was actually pretty busy. I gave a couple lectures on local history, and what did you do?
What did I do? Well, I built some underground hideouts for your newly acquired hamster.
Our newly acquired hamster.
For those of you out there that don't know, Beth got a long-haired Syrian hamster by the name of Mr. Chonkers, and he looks like a teddy bear. He is really cute.
He does look like a teddy bear, and I have to correct you. We got a hamster.
Right. Beth wanted a hamster, and I went along with it. And I bought it. So that means that we got a hamster, but it's Beth's. So for those of you who haven't seen Mr. Chonkers, you can see him on our Facebook page.
Which I have to say you posted. So, he's my hamster, but you seem awfully proud of him.
Well, some people suggested that he should become the new mascot.
Oh, well, he should. He's adorable.
Yeah, he's cute. He's also expensive.
Well, he wasn't expensive.
Everything else for him's expensive. So you buy a $30 hamster and you put $400 into everything else.
Well, not everybody would do that. They're not married to you.
I might have to put his face on a T-shirt and start selling them to recoup some of the money.
Anyway, with that wonderful promise, we have a great show for you tonight. It's one of those stories that makes me happy because there is so much information, and it's just a really cool mystery.
Yeah, I've got to say, we've put out some really good episodes. Really excellent topics. But this one, I think, is by far my favorite.
Wow, that's saying a lot.
Yeah, this one's really, really good.
All right, well, since we've built it up so much, should I get started?
Well, yes, by all means, let's get into tonight's episode.
All right. So if you visit Wallaceburg's McDonald Park in southern Ontario, you might notice a bright blue historical marker with a rather long inscription. It says, quote, "On September 5th, 1804, 15 families of Scottish emigrants, numbering some 90 persons, landed near this site. Named after an estate in Scotland, the settlement was sponsored by Lord Selkirk, who later founded the Red River Colony. The low-lying and frequently flooded lands were difficult to work. Malaria killed many settlers, and the superintendent, Alexander MacDonald, proved incapable. In July 1812, the colony was invaded by American militia, who carried off its livestock. The remaining settlers ultimately moved back to higher land, and in 1818, Selkirk sold his property." End quote. Now, that's a lot to fit on one little marker, and it's packed full of interesting information that would make anyone interested in history want to know more about this small Scottish settlement that began with an explorer, suffered through malaria and an invasion, and then just faded into nothing. But what the marker doesn't say is that the settlement also experienced one of the most well-documented poltergeists in Canadian history that became known as the Baldoon Mystery. In fact, one of the people who suffered through the paranormal activity published a book in 1910 that documents the terrifying events that plagued his family for a year beginning in 1829. It's a pretty incredible story, and I'll be sharing quite a bit of the beginning of this book. The haunting, if that's what it was, included everything from marching footsteps to thrown objects to spontaneous fires. But first, I want to go a little bit into the history of Baldoon, since most of it ties directly to the poltergeist. Lord Thomas Selkirk of Scotland began encouraging displaced Highlanders to colonize Canada in the early 1800s. In 1803, he sponsored the settlement of 800 families on Prince Edward Island, and in 1804, he sponsored another 15 families to settle in Baldoon in southern Ontario. According to HauntedWalk.com, he wanted Baldoon to be as similar to the Scottish Highlands as possible, so he imported sheep too. Unfortunately, Baldoon turned out to be mostly swampland and unsuitable for farming. The sheep had little to graze on, and an outbreak of malaria swept through the small community. Lord Selkirk continued to fund the settlement, but when the Americans invaded during the War of 1812 and took all of the remaining livestock for themselves, several members of the community gave up and left. Lord Selkirk ended up selling Baldoon. But John MacDonald and his family, including his young son Neil, decided to stick it out. John's father Daniel lived on his own homestead nearby. Unfortunately, according to Neil MacDonald in his book The Baldoon Mystery, another neighboring family had their eye on the land that his father John had claimed for himself. This unnamed family, whom Neil MacDonald referred to as the Long Low Log House family, consisted of an old woman, 2 sons, and a daughter. He described them as, quote, not nice people, but were remarkable for a sullen, resentful air and made few friends, end quote. They apparently approached John MacDonald and offered to buy this parcel of land, but MacDonald refused to sell it to them. Things were okay for a while. The MacDonalds worked their land and managed a fruitful harvest. But then one day, when the MacDonald men were off in the fields and the MacDonald women had gone into the barn to gather straw that they planned to weave into hats, something very, very strange happened. As the, quote, rafters of the old barn rang with many a youthful laugh, and the women and younger girls sat working in a circle, one of the wooden poles that held the roof up came crashing to the barn floor. The women were stunned, but luckily no one was hurt. Then, within seconds, another loud crash filled the air as a second pole hit the ground. They all jumped up and did their best to try and figure out why the roof seemed to be caving in, but they couldn't find any explanation for why it was happening. They gathered around again and got back to work. Pretty soon they were laughing and joking once more, only to be interrupted by the crash of a third pole. Well, the third time was the charm, pun intended, and the women fled from the barn in total terror. They rushed into the safety of the house and talked about what possibly could have caused all 3 poles to come down and how lucky they were that no one had been injured. They must have agreed that they should tell the men as soon as they came home, and eventually the women turned their attention to the other chores that needed to be done inside the house. Suddenly, one of the windows shattered, and a bullet fell at their feet in the middle of the floor. Shocked that a hunter would be so careless, they stared at it in disbelief. How it could come through a window and then land as if it were merely dropped out of someone's hand made no sense to them. But before they truly had time to wonder what was happening, another bullet came flying through the window and landed as though dropped right next to the first. This was followed by a shower of bullets that landed harmlessly all around them. Completely terrified, the women fled from the house and ran out into the empty yard and to the nearest neighbor, the McDougals. Mr. L.A. McDougall listened to the women's story, and he said he'd go back to the farm with them. He was completely shocked to find the house exactly as they had described. Dozens of bullet holes dotted the glass windows, and yet all of the bullets lay on the floor. They hadn't hit anything inside the house itself. It was as if they'd been fired from a gun at close range and yet been stopped by some invisible force and had just fallen straight to the ground. When John MacDonald returned home, he did his best to calm his family. But for the next 9 days, it was all the small community could talk about. Some people asked to see these bullets for themselves and kept them as souvenirs. Others hoped to examine the bullets to see if they were some sort of trick. And some whispered that the MacDonalds certainly seemed to enjoy all of the attention. But then around midnight one night in the summer of 1829, Mrs. MacDonald woke her husband up because she was certain someone was in their kitchen. They both listened and heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking back and forth. Afraid that the intruder might harm their youngest child, whose bedroom was also right off the kitchen, Mr. MacDonald jumped out of bed and flung open the bedroom door. The walking immediately ceased, and MacDonald found himself staring into an empty kitchen. For the following year, the MacDonalds were awoken every so often by the sound of some phantom walking back and forth across their kitchen. At times, these heavy footsteps seemed to rush towards their closed bedroom door as if someone were going to burst in, and then they'd stop, begin again, and head away from the door. Eventually, the footsteps happened during the daytime, too, and they seemed to rush up behind the women of the house, especially when they were alone. They'd whirl around, expecting to see some intruder, but of course, no one was ever there. And the bullet throwing hadn't stopped. It continued until every window in the house was broken, and John MacDonald had no choice but to board each one up. But even this didn't stop them. Allegedly, they'd hear the bullets hit the wood, and then they would suddenly appear on the floor as if they had magically passed through the solid boards. At this point, everyone knew about the terribly strange events happening at the MacDonald house, and more than a few curious people came to see for themselves. Like Neil Campbell, a man who claimed he could rid the MacDonald's farm from whatever poltergeist had taken over. He barely made it through the front door when a heavy stone came through the window and hit him right in the chest. He was pretty rattled. Neil T. MacDonald wrote, quote, "The blood left his cheeks and beads of perspiration bedewed his brow. He was as pale as death and trembled in every limb." End quote. Campbell apparently picked up the stone, carried it to the nearby river, and threw it in. He'd barely walked back into the house when the very same stone seemed to manifest out of thin air and landed at his feet. Another witness named William F. Fleury came to the MacDonald farm to see the poltergeist in action as well, and he also wasn't disappointed. One of the MacDonald children, a baby of only a few months old, was in a wooden cradle on the floor. As Fleury and John MacDonald talked, the cradle began to rock so violently that both men feared that the baby would be dumped out. It took both men using all of their strength to hold the cradle steady while Mrs. MacDonald rescued the baby. Another witness claimed that they watched a bar of soap float up into the air and then fly across the room. It actually hit one of the MacDonald children in the back. As if targeting the children wasn't alarming enough, several witnesses claimed to see the dishes levitate from the MacDonald's dining table and to see the iron tools hanging next to the hearth bang against each other. Some even witnessed chairs and even tables fall over onto the floor all on their own. And in one equally violent moment, a tea kettle's top blew off, the kettle fell onto its side, and then was raised up by unseen hands and flung onto the floor. It was also pretty scary when a knife flung itself across the room, and its 10-inch blade stuck deep into the window casing. I mean, when we're talking poltergeist activity, that's pretty freaking violent.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
All these things literally lifting up and flying around this house.
The bullets are what gets me.
So weird.
I could see going through the windows, but then just stopping midair and just dropping, or them hitting the board, not going through, and then be on the floor inside.
I know, it's bizarre.
It really is.
Well, one day, instead of bullets, a shower of lead sinkers that they would use for fishing rained down on the MacDonald's kitchen floor instead. John MacDonald's prized possession, a wide fishing net, didn't have a single sinker left on it, but it was as if the sinkers had never been attached to begin with, since every single one had been removed from the net without cutting a single thread, which was a feat that nobody could explain. Just like the stone that had been thrown at Neil Campbell, when John MacDonald, or anyone else for that matter, threw the loose sinkers into the river, they'd reappear almost immediately right at their feet. Now, you might be wondering how the MacDonalds could claim that it was the exact same bullets or rocks or sinkers that they had just thrown in the river. Well, on several occasions, they made a point of marking several of the items with unique marks, just so they could prove it. Visitor Alexander Brown claimed that while visiting the MacDonald farm, he witnessed Mrs. MacDonald give the family dog the leftovers in a pot to lick clean. Without warning, the ladle which she had left in the pot rose into the air and actually began smacking the dog. the terrified dog ran out of the house and didn't come back. Now, legend says that they somehow found out that somebody in Michigan had found their dog. Usually, the McDonalds would welcome any travelers into their home. But as the intensity of this haunting increased, they became understandably wary of allowing strangers into their house. But one evening, a stranger arrived from New York, asking if he could lodge there just for the night. John McDonald reluctantly told him what was happening in their home. But this stranger said he didn't mind, and he actually looked forward to the possible entertainment. In fact, as he gratefully entered the house, he said something to the effect of, "I doubt I'll come across anything worse than myself." Dumb words, shouldn't have said it.
Yeah, it's just asking for trouble.
Yes, because as soon as he said it, the gun that he was carrying exploded. Now, poor Neil McDonald. Neil McDonald in his book described it, he said exploded, but I don't know if it means that it fired or if it actually exploded. But regardless, at the exact same moment, John McDonald's gun, which had been leaning against the fireplace, also exploded. As the two men reached for their guns, both firearms eluded their grasps, and several tense moments followed as they tried to get their hands on them. So it sounds to me like the guns were scooting all over the freaking house, and they couldn't grab them. The Yankee Wanderer returned to New York and repeated the tale of the haunted McDonald farm so often that even more people came to see for themselves. Peddler Patrick Tobin had his own experience at the McDonald farm. While stopping over to sell his wares, he claimed that 20 silver pieces had gone missing from his purse. The McDonalds assured him that they hadn't taken it, and that if he was willing to wait, the money would most likely reappear. They told him that objects often disappeared in the house and then would reappear. Tobin was willing to wait, and he ended up spending the night. The following morning at breakfast, a silver piece fell out of the air onto Tobin's plate with a loud ping. One by one, 18 more silver pieces seemed to drop out of thin air and land on his plate in front of him. Tobin left with just 19 of his 20 silver coins, telling the McDonald children that if the 20th ever came back, they could have it.
Well, they were pretty strong-willed people, because a lot of people would have just left this house by now.
Exactly. I thought the same thing. Like, they put up with that day after day.
Well, especially since there's bullets coming through, firearms going off, knives being thrown into the door. I mean, it's violent.
Yeah, and their children were in danger.
I mean, who would care if it started raining silver pieces down onto your plate? That's kind of nice.
Right. Well, Baldoon resident Mr. Jason Stewart stopped by the farm one day to share a story he'd heard about another haunting. It had happened in Scotland, and he told the McDonalds that a family had witnessed an empty bucket disappear and then reappear filled with water. The McDonalds said that they'd never had that happen on their farm. Almost as if the house wanted to prove them wrong, a glass of water that was sitting on the table rose into the air and then dumped its contents all over the floor. As you can imagine, this constant poltergeist activity did take its toll on the MacDonald family. John MacDonald had been depressed for months, and his wife was in a perpetual state of fear. But up until this point, they had been able to kind of tough it out. But then, the fires started. And we'll get into those and the rest of this amazing story after this quick break. Hey, did you know? Nikola Tesla had quite the sense of humor. One day, he invited Mark Twain to his laboratory to experience his newest work towards more efficient electricity, a high-frequency oscillator. He told Twain to stand on a platform, turned it on, and watched as poor Twain, who suffered from digestive problems, violently shook with the vibration caused by the piston under his feet. After just 90 seconds, Twain jumped off and ran straight for the bathroom. Tesla was amused, but I doubt Twain found the joke very funny. Who'd have thunk it?
All right, we're back. And as Beth had said, fires began to break out at the MacDonald home all by themselves. The first time a fire spontaneously broke out inside the house, it was witnessed by Mr. Isaiah Brown of Chatham. The two men were sitting and talking in John MacDonald's sitting room, in front of the fire, when all of a sudden, one of the hearthstones literally flew out of its place with such force that it smashed into the front door. The wood splintered in all directions, and each piece that landed on the floor was on fire. Fortunately enough, they were able to put it out. But not long after that, neighbor L.A. McDougall happened to be going up the river by boat with two other men. As they approached the MacDonald farm, McDougall said, quote, "We perceived that John's house was on fire, but as we were some distance from it, we saw that it would be gone before we could reach it. The family were at breakfast yet and had not discovered the danger. Mr. Dan MacDonald's house was nearer to us, and as they saw the fire, they hailed us and asked us to assist them to carry out their furniture, as they expected their own habitation would soon be in flames. We landed and helped them to carry out everything. In the meantime, John's house and barn were reduced to ashes, together with all they contained. The family barely escaped with their lives. He came up to us without his coat, saying that the clothes that he had on were all that they had saved." End quote. 12 spontaneous fires had all started at the exact same time in different parts of the house, and the entire home had burned to the ground. The community rallied around the family and offered them all the help they could. Several witnesses came forward to share their own experiences in the house, like William Stewart, who said, quote, "At the time of this trouble, I lived about 3/4 of a mile from the place, and was present and saw for myself many of these strange things. I was present when the barn was burned, and also when a man by the name of Harmon was preaching there. At this time, a large stone came right through the door, breaking out one of the panels, and rolled in front of the minister. The stone had apparently come out of the water. A search was made about the house, but no person could be seen. I also saw a loaf of bread move off the table and dance around the room. The owner of the house, John T. MacDonald, I know to be a very respectable man." End quote. The MacDonald family decided that it would be best if they moved in with John's father, Daniel. Daniel lived in a 2-story black-framed house on the banks of the river. For many weeks, things were much better. The poltergeist hadn't seemed to follow them, and John's depression slowly faded. They were able to laugh again and relax. It seemed as if the horrible experience was behind them. One morning, Miss McDonald and a younger family relative were out in the garden. One of them happened to look up and noticed a cute little dog lying on the front steps of the house. Neither one of them recognized the little black dog, but the younger girl decided that she would care for it until its owner came looking for it. As the two women approached the dog, it woke up from its nap and took off running around the house as if it thought this was a great game. The women laughed and took off after the playful animal in opposite directions. But as they met up at the back of the house, the dog was nowhere to be seen. They thought that it was rather strange, and as they walked back to the front of the house, the younger girl happened to look up. The poor little dog was now lying in the second-story eaves trough, or rain gutter. Its head hung over the edge, with its tongue hanging out of its mouth. That was the horrible beginning of the second bout of poltergeist activity for the McDonalds. Everything that had happened in their own home now began to happen in Daniel McDonald's home. The sound of phantom footsteps started up first, and before long, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor began. Stones began flying through the upper story's windows. And then their livestock began to die, every last one of them. First, the 2 oxen dropped dead in the field. Then, one by one, all of their hogs died. Next, their horses died right in their stalls. And lastly, every one of their chickens died as well. And then, inexplicably, the old woman who lived in the long, low log house made an appearance. All this time, the family had kept to themselves. But suddenly, the old woman offered to weave a rug for the afflicted family. She said she wouldn't do the work on their property, but as long as they agreed to let her do this, quote, "No trouble will befall your house while you're engaged in my business," end quote. McDonald was reluctant to agree, but he did, and lo and behold, for the entire time it took the old woman to weave a rug, not a single bad thing happened at the McDonald farm. As soon as she finished it, though, and presented it to them, the activity started right back up where it had left off. Investigators Captain Louis Bennett and Mr. John Jones witnessed all the things that had previously happened, exploding guns and all. But they also witnessed one of the McDonald's babies in their cradle suddenly scream as if it were in terrible pain. A burning hot rock was found lodged between the child and the cradle. It was so hot that it actually sizzled when it was dropped in cold water. And then the house itself began to move. Allegedly, on more than one occasion, the entire house raised between 1 and 3 feet in the air. Now, at this point, authorities in Toronto decided to get involved. They thought that the McDonalds were likely orchestrating all of the activity themselves as a hoax or trick for attention. And if they just removed the family from the house, it would all stop. So, the entire McDonald family moved temporarily to Running Creek, and neighborhood volunteers offered to help the police officers watch the house. Not only did the alarming activity start bothering the McDonalds at their temporary home, the volunteers also witnessed it still happening at the house. L.A. McDougall said, quote, "My father and Mr. John McNeil volunteered to watch the house. As they sat talking, they saw smoke issue from a small closet. On examining, they found a fire nicely built on the floor with corn cobs and coal. There was but one entrance to the closet, and no one could have gone in there without their knowledge. They extinguished it, but soon smoke began to come from the wall. They tore away the lats and plaster, and there found another fire similar to the one in the closet. And so it continued for some time. As fast as they extinguished it in one spot, it broke out in another. till Mr. McDonald remarked that whatever had the power to do this could also, if so minded, throw the house down upon them, so that it was better to leave this place to its fate. End quote. The baffled police had no choice but to return to Toronto with no answers. The McDonald family moved back to their house, but refused to go inside. Instead, they set up large tents in the front yard. But the house kept pulling them in. More spontaneous fires seemed to crop up almost daily, forcing them to go inside just to put them out. And even outdoors became a problem. First, winter was coming. But second, when they'd hang their washing on the line to dry, it too would burst into flames. Eventually, the threat of snow made the family go back indoors. Daniel moved back into his 2-story house, and John McDonald and his family moved into a small log cabin on the property. At this point, Robert Barker arrived. Barker was a teacher, but he also had a deep interest in the occult, and he thought that he could use his knowledge to drive out the McDonald poltergeists. First, he wrote the following message on a large piece of heavy paper. I command you, troublesome spirit, to leave this house in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Then he nailed a horseshoe above the front door. His attempts at exorcising the evil spirit from the house didn't do anything except catch the attention of the British authorities, who promptly ordered his arrest for pretending to practice witchcraft.
I love that he wasn't arrested for practicing witchcraft, but for pretending to practice witchcraft.
I know, it's rather unusual. Barker was sitting with the McDonalds one day when word came that Constable George Barnshaw was on his way to arrest him. Barker fled to the Black Creek to hide out, but was quickly apprehended. Barnshaw handcuffed him at gunpoint, loaded him into a canoe, and brought him to the nearest courthouse in Windsor, Ontario. Barker sat in jail for 6 months before he was brought to trial. He was in bad shape by this point, malnourished and filthy. During the trial, he insisted that he hadn't taken any money for the services that he had performed for the McDonalds, and he pleaded with the court to take pity on his now destitute family. The king granted him a pardon. With Barker treated the way that he had been treated, John McDonald knew his only option now for getting rid of the poltergeist was to appeal to the church for help. A Catholic priest arrived at McDonald's home, prepared to stay for an entire week. And he did, performing multiple daily prayers. He even asked the McDonalds to pray for forgiveness for any crimes they may have committed back in Scotland. But the McDonalds insisted that they didn't have any crimes to repent. The father left the house just as haunted as it was before he arrived. In 1830, John McDonald turned to Reverend McDormand, a Methodist minister, for help. The two of them traveled to Long Point to meet with a man named Dr. John F. Troyer. Troyer had come from Pennsylvania in 1789 and settled in Long Point. With an Amish family background, he didn't actually have any medical degree, but he was so well known for his medical abilities and herbal remedies that everyone called him doctor. He was also known for encouraging witch hunts and for inventing a witch trap that was nothing more than a glorified bear trap. His story is filled with ironies. For example, he claimed to have stolen a witch's broom from her home and then used to fly around himself just so he could spy on other witches. So that's pretty interesting in itself, that this man claimed to have done all kinds of things that people were persecuted for. But he was never persecuted because he claimed he did them in order to fight against witches. But anyway, according to TorontoGhost.com, Dr. Troyer's daughter was said to have the gift of sight, and she claimed during the McDonald's visit that she saw a long, low log house. In the house was an old woman who wished nothing but harm to the McDonald family. She had the power to turn herself into a goose, and the only way McDonald could stop her was to shoot her with a silver bullet while she was in her goose form. Well, obviously, Mr. McDonald knew that it had to be the old woman who had wanted to buy his land years before, the same woman who had woven the rug during the only period of calm that the family had felt in a year. McDonald also realized that a strange goose had recently joined his flock back at home. And so McDonald returned to Baldoon. He molded a silver bullet, loaded it into his gun, and waited. He invited witnesses to the house to see the shooting for themselves. And soon enough, the strange goose showed itself. McDonald aimed and fired, but at the last second, the goose startled, and the bullet merely tore through the bird's wing. Convinced that this was good enough, McDonald and the witness went to the long, low log house and pounded on the door. It took a while, but eventually the old woman answered the door. She said she was in great pain as she held one arm in place with the other, and lo and behold, her arm was broken. And with that, not a single unexplained thing ever happened to the McDonald house again. The poltergeist was gone. Or as John McDonald now believed, the curse had been lifted.
Such a great story.
It truly is a great story. I really enjoyed this one.
And I found it so interesting that when Neil MacDonald wrote the book in 1910, he had dozens and dozens of witnesses who came forward and supplied all of these recollections about what happened. And it's interesting that not a single one of them suspected the old woman until the very, very end.
Yeah, I think they were so focused on the fires and the poltergeist activity that it just didn't dawn on them to think that this old woman may have cursed them.
Yeah, having fires spontaneously break out at all hours would kind of occupy your time.
I mean, it seems like they were living under a lot of stress.
Absolutely.
So perhaps they just couldn't see the obvious.
Right. Yeah.
Well, whatever the reason, it's truly like I said, a cool story. I mean, this had a lot of poltergeist activity in it, and I find that fascinating.
Yes. And, that historical marker that's in McDonald Park doesn't, like we said at the beginning, doesn't say anything about the Baldoon Mystery. It just says that this is where the settlement was.
Right.
So it'd be interesting to see if, because the Canadian government could do something. They could put up another sign, be neat if there was a log cabin that they might put on I don't know, something to maybe get more attention to the story, but.
Yeah. So you would think that they would want to have this story out there for people to know, unless they're kind of ashamed of it.
Oh, could be. I mean.
Maybe they figure it taints the history of the place?
Well, yeah, they did blame this, old woman that just kept to herself for the whole thing. She may not even have been to blame.
That could very well be. Well, there you have it, folks.
The Baldoon Mystery.
Come to your own determination as what you think may have been causing this.
Yeah.
Could it have been the old woman? And it was just a coincidence when he shot the goose that it happened to stop? We'll never know.
But if you would like to know more, the PDF version of The Baldoon Mystery by Neil MacDonald is online. If you can kind of make your way through the older English, it's actually a very, very interesting read. Not that 1910 is like old English, but it's definitely different than 2025 English. But it's worth a read for sure.
And with that said, that about wraps it up for this episode. Join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
And thank you all for your continued support.
See you next week for an all-new episode.